Hey, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and today I'm going to show you how to make this simple router jig for cutting shelf rabbets. Check it out. So this thing sort of came about because I have a closet project coming up and I need to rip a bunch of rabbets in the side walls of the cabinets, and I want a nice tight fit and I want to simplify the process because I have to do a lot of shelves. Originally I was running my router just along a guide rail, but the problem with that is that the setup time kind of takes a while, and I wanted something that was basically zero clearance, that I could make my lines, lay something out, run the router through it and keep moving. This particular one that I'm going to make today is 36 inches deep so that I can accommodate two 18-inch deep shelf sides. I am going to be using this rigid cordless router for this. I also have the same exact router but with a cord, and what's nice about this is the plate right here is interchangeable. The holes are the same, so this jig that I'm making for my router will work for either my cordless rigid or my plug-in rigid, but you can adapt this to any router that you're going to do. Something that was important for me on this was to try to take as many variables out of the equation as I possibly could. That's why I went with sort of a wider plate and with this little piece on the side that you're going to see. Now I know that they make adapters for the track systems as well, like the Makita and the DeWalt have router adapters. The issue that I had with that was I wanted something that was going to be zero clearance, and I didn't want to hit the splinter guard on my track with a router bit. So with this, it's dedicated, it's easy, and I can just set it up and go. So let's get into making this and get started. In my case, the router bit that I'm using is this 3/4 inch. This is a Freud bearing guide rabbeting bit. And so when I was originally just trying to do this with just this plate, I made this little piece of material specifically to be 1.25 inches thick. So you could really make this out of anything. I just so happen to have some extra material that I happen to be making this project out of. This is 3/4 inch cedar veneered plywood, and this is some 1/2 inch MDF. And now this, in combination with this bit, gives me a nice flat surface, being the MDF, for this to ride against, and it keeps me at the right depth in my material. I'm going for about 1/4 inch depth of cut. So that was why I made this 1.25 inches, but you could easily make this 3/4 inch, you could make it 1.5 inches. Just depends on the kind of router bit that you're using and what your setup is. I'm going to take this over to the table saw and I'm going to rip this down again to get rid of these little cuts, and we'll keep going. I'm going to take the base plate off my router. And again, this is cordless, so the battery's out, but if this was a corded, you'd want to make sure your router was unplugged. Now over here on the drill press, I've got a Forstner bit that is bigger than the head of this screw, and I'm just going to make sure that I counterbore this in to the thickness of the head of the screw. And whenever you're doing a counterbore operation, which is when a counterbore is when you make a square bottomed hole and then you have another hole through it, as opposed to a countersink, which is a tapered hole. With a counterbore operation with a Forstner bit, you always want to drill your Forstner hole first, because the point of the Forstner will act as a guide for your next drill bit, as opposed to drilling these out first. Then the Forstner bit has a tendency to wander unless you use a really small pilot hole. With any operation like this, I like to drill the first hole and then set my depth stop. For the hole in the center, I'm going to use 1.25 inch Forstner bit just so that I know I have enough room around the hole for my router to run, my router bit to run. Now I'm just checking this to make sure that it's nice and flat. Feels like it is, but I'm going to take a razor blade and just scrape it a little bit. And yes, by doing that I did scratch up the surface a little bit, but it got those burrs down, so I'm happy about that. So now it's ready to put this on this guide. So I'm going to install the router bit that I'm going to be using and butt it up against this to get me an idea of where my plate needs to go on this side. Here's a sample of the rabbet depth that I'm going for. So I just want to make sure I set this exactly how I'm going to be using it. It's not super critical that the depth is correct. I'm really going for the width, but it doesn't hurt. Lock that down. I want to make this have a little block on this side so that when I'm pushing this, it doesn't really want to rock. It'll just run. And the other thing that's important is I don't want it to grab the material and jump out. It's important that it doesn't go in this direction, because if it goes in that direction, it'll ruin my rabbet. I want this to run nice and parallel all the time. So I'm going to grab a square, check this for square, and then mark the bottom with a knife so that I can have a nice reference. And then we'll put a little piece of material in here that'll run as a guide, and it'll make it so it's a little bit adjustable. A little bit of play is all right, but in general I want it to be pretty tight. So you can see that scribe line I just got in there, that's going to be my target. So I'm going to take another piece of material and put it underneath here as the guide. So here's what I'm going to be using as the guide on this side. This is a piece of cutting board. I bought these at IKEA. They were super cheap, maybe like a couple bucks. And this is like a super slick plastic material. So I had already cut a piece off of this one for another project. I think I'm just going to use this, and I'm going to use this slick side. I'll recut this on the table saw to get a nice flat cut, and I'm going to mount this to the bottom here, and it'll act as my slide piece against the masonite. So this is running perfect right now. This block is nice and smooth. The bearing is running nice and smooth. There's like no play outward. So I'm actually just going to leave these clamps on here, and I'm going to take a couple of short screws, and I'm going to pre-drill and put a couple of screws in there, maybe 3 screws, to try and keep this alignment exactly where it is. Okay, so this is exactly what I was going for. This thing slides nice on here. There's a little bit of play, but it's only in the sort of wiggle, and I kind of need it for this to move well. So now the other thing I want to do is I want to put a square registration bar on this end so that I can just butt this right up against my piece of material and rip a nice square rabbet in side panel. So let's take care of that. So with this 90-degree stop on here, all that's left is to kind of test it out. So we can imagine this was a side panel, something that I wanted a shelf to be sat in. Put that square right up against the edge. I'll be able to just take the router now and run it right up this. So something I want to do is on the back side of this, I want a space for the router to nest, which will give me the same depth every time as like a little depth stop, and it'll keep this from blowing out. So the first path I'm going to do on this test cut is I'm actually going to pull towards me when normally I would push away. So let's get a battery in this and give it a try. So what that first cut let me know was that I absolutely need a clamp on this. So let's try that again, a little more locked in. So now that this is clamped, it's nice and solid, I'm going to run a pass and see how it does. Put it in there. It's a really nice tight fit. So with this, I can pretty much go up to a piece of material. I can make my marks, put this in, lock it down with some clamps, and know that I'm going to route a nice straight channel. And at least for 3/4 inch material, I know it's going to give me that nice tight fit that I'm looking for. So now that I know that this sort of works, it makes a ton of dust. So I have this extra fitting, so I'm thinking if I use this, I can put this over here on the back side on an angle by cutting this away and sort of bending it out. I can screw it into there and then hook a vacuum up to this, and then as I make my cut, it'll probably evacuate most of that dust. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with the Dremel. Now I'm going to heat this up with a torch, and I should be able to bend that out and then sort of warp this onto there so I get a little bit of a dust chute, and then I can cut this back at an angle so that it sits on there nice and gives me something to suck the dust up. That'll about do it. So I just got to put some little screws in there to keep this down. Alright, so I got this little dust collection thing set up. Let's give this another try. All right, worked pretty good. So I took this panel and I just broke the edges with some sandpaper. It's a really nice fit. All right, that about does it for this one. Thanks for watching. Again, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything. If you have any questions about any of the processes or any of the stuff I did in this video, be sure to leave me a comment down below. If you want to see behind the scenes stuff, things we do in the shop, projects we're working on, follow us on Instagram at Make Everything Shop. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more content like this. I love making little things like this, little jigs, so if you want to see more of this stuff, be sure to let me know. Thanks again, and we'll see you on the next video.